In Springfield, an event was held to educate families on how to protect themselves from dangerous situations. Safe or self-protection awareness and family empowerment was led by local martial artists and community organizers at South Congressional Church today. One of the event organizers, Nikita Perez, feels this topic is important as her daughter was recently approached by a man claiming to have candy in his car. Thankfully, her daughter knew what to do through previous conversations with her mom and ran away in the opposite direction.
Organize this because I do not feel that this situation is being taken seriously around the city. It has happened to multiple children in multiple areas of the city. There are still other people out there, and the education around what to do in those situations is very important because it will continue to happen.
To end the event, participants were given keychains equipped with an alarm and flashlight as an extra form of protection.